Well, hello there. How is everyone? I hope you're all well on this marvellous, marvellous Monday, because it's Monday still. And I'm giving you an extra one, baby. I'm giving you an extra one because you're amazing, you look amazing, you are amazing, and what do you do for people who you feel like that way about? Well, you give them as much stuff as you possibly can. And that's what I'm doing here. As I found an article, I did a video yesterday talking about parallel construction. These kind of ways that law enforcement operate in terms of hiding how they found someone because it's either something that's not constitutionally correct, and try to simultaneously do something to obtain the same result, but doing that legally, doing that right. And hopefully they can do it, so they don't have to admit that they did something wrong. And in the Idaho 4 case, there are various ways that this could have gone down. We could talk about, for instance, that there could have been someone who flat out pointed at Bryan Kohberger and said, "That's your man." And that could have been someone who was just wrong. That could have been someone like, say, Demetrius Robinson, for instance. He could have been leveraged upon. We've seen him and Emma Bailey seemingly walk scot-free from incidents that other people would find themselves incarcerated for. And they just happen to be around this situation. And look, did they inform on someone that they had come across, had dealings with? Who knows? Who knows? We also have the Bryan Kohberger situation in the background, and even though some people feel that there is absolutely nothing that can convince them that Bryan Kohberger had anything to do with this at all, because there simply isn't any proof, but at this stage, there are a few people who could be involved, but there doesn't seem to be any proof. There are only the speculations and thoughts of people like law enforcement, who ultimately are just humans with a badge, and they can get things wrong. But look, coincidences exist, they do exist, so even though we have the Bryan Kohberger and Bryan Kohberger situations that both individually are very, very rare, and then you put their situations together, that is almost like me winning the lottery. Not likely going to happen. But anyway, there are alternatives that kind of run hand in hand with how we're seeing this situation play out. And when we were talking about this this methodology that is used in law enforcement, it made me go back to see whether anybody else had thought the same earlier on, and they did indeed. And I found an article, and the link to that article will be in the description of this video, but I'm going to go through it with you because it's incredibly interesting, and I do think that this is pretty much what the vast majority of people will believe is how this case panned out. Now, I don't know whether this is going to better support the guilters narrative or the Bryan Kohberger is innocent and perhaps wrongfully accused. I think you could pretty much go down the middle. It depends upon how much you trust the genetic genealogy system and how that plays out, and how the DNA got on the knife sheath in the first place, and whether that was indeed trustworthy at all. But anyway, let's get straight into it and suck on some meat and potatoes, baby. So, like I say, the link to this is in the description. A legal battle behind closed doors may be the most important and consequential legacy of the identification and prosecution of Bryan Kohberger for the murders of 4 University of Idaho students in November of 2022. I think that that's fair to say. Yeah, that is absolutely right. Absolutely right. The state is fighting the defense discovery motion with regard to the use of forensic genetic genealogy during the investigation, claiming it is outside the scope of the discovery statute and immaterial to the defense, and in doing so has confirmed its use. And remember, this is going back to June last year, so nearly a year has passed, and we know how much this has progressed and how much this battle for discovery, even to this day, as we're staring down a barrel of a heron in just a few days' time, this is still on the table as an issue that is being challenged. So yeah, this a year ago, and we're not, in terms of all this, we're not really any further forward, apart from we've had witnesses who came forward to try and dispute it and got challenged by the FBI. I expect the defence to file a more specific motion to compel and to argue vigorously that disclosure is in fact vital to the case, which we know eventually happened. The judge's ruling may well determine how this case is both prosecuted and defended, with legal reverberations to future cases in which genetic genealogy is used to develop suspects. It certainly will affect how the case is covered, how the investigation is memorialised in books and documentaries, and may finally lead to the general public understanding that law enforcement narratives often contain omissions and a quasi-legal retrofitting known as parallel construction. So even back then, a year ago, way before I'd even heard about this, and I know that some of you, when I mentioned it the other day, yesterday, you hadn't heard of this. So many people know that these things happen. It's just actually penning. They didn't realise that it actually had a name. It was used that frequently. That Bryan Kohberger was identified as a suspect by forensic or investigative genetic genealogy has been an open secret for months. The New York Times wrote a full reported article on June 10th, a week after I posted this piece. The affidavit for Kohberger's arrest, replete with a gripping narrative of chronological cause and effect police work, is largely a fiction in the way a glowing profile of a young, successful entrepreneur might omit the fact they have a gigantic trust fund. In fact, the investigation was stalled and would not have been solved without the minuscule amount of touched DNA on the knife sheath Kohberger left, apparently, near his first victims and genetic genealogy. The prosecution can and does leave investigative steps out of probable cause affidavits. The PCAs can be written in a way that implies a chronology of investigative steps and obscures the chaotic and multi-pronged swirl of simultaneous methods and processing of leads. This is called parallel construction. Parallel construction is a law enforcement process of building a parallel or separate evidentiary basis for a criminal investigation in order to conceal how an investigation actually began. To some extent, parallel construction is a giant lie of omission. The prosecution likely would prefer not to present witnesses and evidence regarding forensic genealogy at trial because it adds complexity and is less specific than evidence they subsequently develop. There is also currently, what they're trying to say here is, this is like, do the ends justify the means? Because you could just turn around and say, well, we done a buccal swab of Bryan Kohberger's cheek, and it matched the DNA that was present on the knife sheath found at the scene of the crime. Now that is very simple, it's simplistic, it's not dirty, it's not anything. The problem comes when you have to say, well, how did you get to Bryan Kohberger actually in the first place? That's where the sticking point is in this case, and that's why, me personally, I do feel that there was potentially a witness or a confidential informant situation here. But anyway, we'll go on, because this article will tie up what they believe was how FBI, their verbiage reflected witness and DNA. But anyway, here we go. There is also currently a massive behind-the-scenes scrum among law enforcement, the legal community, and the genealogy community about the use of genetic genealogy in active versus cold cases. The FBI, which has stood up its own genetic genealogy lab, specifically instructs police not to mention its use in arrest affidavits and legal filings. The argument is that it is merely a tip or a lead or a technique that once the suspect's actual DNA is gathered and other support and evidence is amassed is both irrelevant and a distraction. In other words, we will give you some information, but you can't tell people where that information comes from. And it does in a second go deeper into this. More to the point, there are moral, legal, and privacy rights ramifications The increasingly widespread use of ordinary Americans' genetic material and the backlash may well hamstring law enforcement going forward. The moral quagmire and lack of legal boundaries is well exemplified in a recent case where a rape victim's DNA gathered from her forensic exam was used to link her to and charge her with an unrelated crime. Meanwhile, for the defense, the idea that this process of developing suspects is exempt from discovery and cross-examination when all other investigative procedures, processes, tips, leads, personnel reports, etc., are not, even if they proved fruitless or are not used in the trial by the prosecution, is absurd and smacks of a kind of unconstitutional secrecy, treading on the Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial and the right to confront evidence. It's one of those things, isn't it? The guilty, or those that are assumed guilty, have the right to face their accuser. Now, if that accuser is basically a system like genealogy, then they have the right to face that and challenge it. No different than if an individual says, you're the person who did it. There are excellent articles and videos on forensic genealogy online, as well as fascinating, extremely well done podcasts on the first crime solved with the technique. The Bear Brook podcast uncovered an unknown serial killer, after which the same genealogist was tapped to identify the Golden State Killer. But briefly, crime scene DNA cannot be matched in CODIS. The nationwide law enforcement DNA database is subjected to a different extractive process and then uploaded to Family Tree DNA and or GEDmatch, the two commercial databases where users can opt in to allow law enforcement comparisons. Distant relatives of the person who left the DNA at the crime scene are identified, and then a genealogist reverse engineers a family tree that will include that person. Law enforcement then looks at the likely suspects within that family tree, narrowing by location, age, criminal history, etc. The final step is to directly obtain suspect DNA for a match, which is often done surreptitiously. You see, we have to consider how this was done here. Why, again, when we think about parallel construction, were the traffic stops a way of obtaining Bryan Kohberger's DNA? Or did they literally wait? They felt confident enough and wait until they got the buccal swab. A close reading of the probable cause affidavit for Kohberger's arrest reveals a subtext, almost invisible ink of a parallel secret investigation. The key to understanding why it is likely that investigative genetic genealogy first brought Kohberger's name into the investigation is the white Elantra, and more specifically when and why the FBI analysis expanded his expert opinion from 2011 to 2013 models to 2011 to 2016 models, which we know happened. Why is the Elantra the key? Two reasons. Number one, why did the WSU officers immediately search for and find Kohberger's car in the parking lot? And those of you who have followed from the beginning, you will remember it was indeed Bryan Kohberger's car was pointed out from the attendant, the security, whatever it was, who was at WSU, and he's the person who reported it. Some people have considered that he was in fact the person who's classed as the informant, if you like. Kohberger's car within the parking lot. Within an hour of finding it on their database, there was reporting that there were 90 white Elantras registered at Idaho State alone. So why did this car get immediate action? 2. At the point when Moscow police asked fellow law enforcement to keep an eye out for white Elantras, it was specifically for the 2011 to 2013 model, which Kohberger didn't have. Logically, and the defense would have immediately noticed this and circled this as part of the affidavit with a big red pen, metaphorically speaking. Moscow police already had Kohberger's name. Another reason to believe investigative genealogy was used is that although the affidavit is written as though the camera footage of the car's journey was pieced together contemporaneously. It clearly was not. That is because they had zero footage after he left Moscow heading south. You can see in the affidavit that his path of time and time of travel immediately after the murders was only determined from cell phone pings after they got the expanded Verizon data on December 23rd, well after they had his name. Here's my hypothesis on the sequence of events. They identify suspect vehicle 1 via local King Street camera footage and are able to track it coming into the neighbourhood, circling around and leaving at 4:20. They do not get the license plate number. They do notice it has no front plate. Simultaneously, they find the sheaf right away and understand that this is a key piece of evidence because unlike searching for the murderer's blood, which will take a long time because, there's blood everywhere in this place. It's a horrendous scene. So, the sheaf most likely belongs to the murderer and is likely to have his DNA unless he used gloves every time he handled it from point of acquisition. This is the bit I struggle with because I struggle to believe that if you're buying this and you already know that you're going to do this crime, why would you not? If you believe Bryan Kohberger's the person who did it, why would he not have continuously handled it with gloves on? Like, don't get me wrong, if the guy's guilty and he did the crime, then thank fuck for the fact that he's an idiot, clearly. But again, that's what you have to question this. You have to question why somebody, if this was preemptive in nature, and they are someone who is working with, in fact, DNA and this entire thing that would eventually hang him is something that he is kind of specialist in. It seems stupidity set in. I also bet that from decades of experience, the FBI knows that criminals know how to wipe down weapons but miss key parts. And such a key part on a sheath is the interior crevice of a sheath snap. Now, my mentality would have been that if I was a criminal, I would make sure that, especially pieces like that, because they're the piece that you're actually handling. I don't get it. Again, there's a hint of stupidity there. They send the sheaf to the Idaho State Police crime lab for testing, and a single source of DNA is identified. Single source is huge. They fast track identifying it. It's not in CODIS, the nationwide DNA database of convicted felons. Meanwhile, the FBI analyst, has given his opinion that the video footage shows a white 2011 to 2013 Elantra. Moscow police decide to try genetic genealogy. The rumor mill keeps mentioning a specialized lab in Texas, and this is almost certainly Othram, which I think this far down the track we can agree. Again, this was a year ago. They submit the single profile to the two databases where people have consented to police access. They get a hit on a relative, and I think fairly close relative because of the speed. A genealogist works up a family tree and identifies a set of names of men. The DNA is male, within a certain age range, probably worked up by the behavioral analysis unit. Police use public and law enforcement databases to query those men. Remember that Kohberger was on the WSU Criminology PhD website with a picture. Kohberger also comes up in law enforcement databases for 2 local traffic stops. Now things are happening fast and simultaneously. They can look at the body cam footage. They can see his driving license. They see his make, model, and license plate number. They have found a person who is local, fits the eyewitness description, and drives a white Elantra with Pennsylvania plates, and Pennsylvania does not use front plates. But his Elantra is the wrong year, according to the FBI expert. They go back to the expert, get him to revise his opinion. They find a way to get WSU to locate the car without directly asking for his name. And now that they know where he lives and works, they pull WSU and Pullman camera footage to reconstruct the beginning and end of his journey on the morning of November 13th. They supplement and bolster this with cell phone pings. once they receive those from Verizon in December, which also allows a reconstruction of his route south on the following day, and thence actual video footage of Kohberger in a grocery store. I'd be very interested to read the subpoena for phone records to Verizon, what probable cause was given. The whole question of when and how they approach him was probably hotly debated. Now they have probable cause, but he has already left on his road trip to Pennsylvania. I don't think he was already being tracked, because remember, about at that time in an interview, Chief Fry sort of slipped up and said, "We don't know where the suspect is," then quickly added, "We don't know who he is." See, I missed that, but that is interesting. If he had said, "We don't know where the suspect is," because again, there was that period of time when he went off the radar. They do get a hit from a license plate reader in Colorado, and then 2 visual confirmation traffic stops in Indiana. It's clear he's headed home for the holidays. They still need confirmation of his actual DNA matching the sheaf sample. There has been at least one case where a suspect identified through genetic genealogy and who was in the right place at the right time and was the right age was not a DNA match to the evidence and was completely not involved in the crime. Coincidences do happen. They likely had been trying to get discarded DNA from him through early December with no luck and had to settle for his family's trash, hoping for his, but instead getting his father's, which is sufficiently dispositive. After the arrest, they promptly collect his DNA to match to the knife sheath. The identification of the DNA from the Kohberger family trash as belonging to the father of the person whose DNA was left on the knife sheath took just 1 day. That's because it is a commonplace process called familial DNA, available to any decent crime lab. However, multiple writers and true crime YouTubers have mistaken this final step prior to Kohberger's arrest as genetic genealogy, and confusion reigns. I'd call out, most egregiously, the author Howard Bloom, who, in writing a book on the case, a book destined to read like pulp law enforcement fanfic, and to bear absolutely no resemblance to the actual investigation, the actual legal process, or any person living or dead. Anyhow, for the defense, they can probe the casual investigative sequence to reveal that Kohberger was a target early on, around November 29th. The New York Times places this at December 19th. They can drill down on when and why the model of the car identified was the identification was expanded, and accuse investigators of retrofitting evidence to their theory. A type of tunnel vision. They can ask why the call was put out for a 2011 to 2013 Elantra, even after Kohberger was identified. That was simply cover for the fact they had already closed other investigative avenues. I absolutely want the judge to rule in favour of the defence, and for the prosecution to fully disclose the who, what, when and where of the genetic genealogy piece of the investigation. I'm extremely interested in actual granular investigations as opposed to heroic narratives or glib parallel constructions. I'm interested in fact-based coverage and discussions. I think the more charged an event or issue, the more vital it is to adhere to the truth. Much more importantly, law enforcement has used parallel construction to obscure the actual sources of critical evidence from view for decades. This practice denies defendants and defense attorneys multiple avenues to challenge admissibility of evidence, the credibility of informants, and the legality of hidden aspects of the investigation. I have experienced this on a small scale directly myself. A few years ago, I provided a tip to law enforcement that directly initiated an investigation leading to an arrest. In the 2 media reports of this arrest, I was bemused to read the lead investigator claiming my tip as a result of her own effort. I believe this was done to protect me, but to see that I was entirely erased from information that I and only I had handed them in my exact words was eye-opening, and it happens all the time. I'm going to skip forward from this bit here. I'm going to come down to here. The extreme secrecy around this pivotal investigative work seems to me to indicate that something fishy is going on. And my hypothesis is that the private lab found very distant matches and began a family tree that was going to take a lot of painstaking, time-consuming work. The FBI then appropriated the DNA profile and did the work in-house and black box. And what I think they did was access off-limits profiles in multiple databases. I think the FBI submitted a sample as if they were a private citizen using the product. I am beginning to think now that it was revealed in late August 2023 that a genetic genealogy witness for the defense received an ominous visit from the FBI subsequent to testifying at a hearing. That something even more shady may be afoot, such as the FBI secretly creating and using its own SMP database. Ofram is doing the same, creating an in-house repository of SMP profiles. That is not conjecture. They have a website soliciting DNA samples from the public. Any of these possibilities exponentially increases the likelihood of getting a close relative match, and that is what I believe happened. The FBI deleted their work, closed the portal, and hid behind the legal constructs of tip and informant. The very reason that 23andMe and Ancestry.com, the biggest genealogical services, closed their databases to law enforcement in the first place was because of abuses and lack of transparency. In a case I link below, a completely innocent guy was brought in for custodial interrogation and his DNA taken by Warren after he was identified by genetic genealogy as a possible suspect. His father has submitted a DNA sample to a family tree project run by his own church, which unbeknownst to him ended up uploaded to one of the major genealogy databases. That service faced media blowback and prospective class action lawsuits and promptly adopted a policy of non-disclosure to law enforcement. If I'm right in my hypothesis, and I think Kohberger's defense is also thinking along these lines, this thing is going to blow up on the prosecution and possibly change the legal landscape to allow defense discovery of investigative genetic genealogy going forward. You might even get some of those rare open court moments where a defense lawyer asks an FBI agent on the stand, which service did you submit the sample to? And they have to admit under oath that they circumvented the rules and possibly the law. There's a lot of information there, a lot of stuff to take in. Now, I'm going to do a live tomorrow night, and we're going to talk about parallel construction a lot more in depth. We're going to go through it and look at alternatives to that as well, because it isn't just how the genetic genealogy system worked in this. And we don't know if this is how it worked, but the fact that there seems to be a missing, like almost like a black hole in all of this. It does seem that the FBI, perhaps, whether they acquired Bryan Kohberger's DNA covertly during those traffic stops and then put that directly into the database to get a match. Who knows? Who knows? But something happened, and something happened that shouldn't have happened. The question is, can you trust the data, and did it point to the right or wrong person? And secondly, do the ends justify the means, or are we going down a very, very grey route? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you all in the next video.